Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Greg Rosen of Bedrock and John Melas-Kyriazi of Spark. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. So we're here to talk about a number of topics, one of which is investing in deep tech. And Greg, you mentioned prior to the podcast that investing in deep tech is not an antidote, but sort of very interesting in light of not that many consumer opportunities happening right now. So I'm curious if you can unpack that. And then we could talk about where you guys define deep tech in terms of investable opportunity and where you're most excited about that right now.
Yeah. So I think one of the other interesting sort of aspects is that I really believe is that the laws of physics of like company building, whether it's a deep tech company, a consumer company, an enterprise SaaS company, are largely the same at a macro level. You still need to hire great people. You need to identify a problem. But the nice thing about deep tech is that you have natural defensibility built in, which means whatever the core that you're building is really, really difficult. And so I think that's super, super valuable looking from a consumer perspective. And so, for example, one of the investments that's unannounced that I'm working on is a gene therapy to extend the lifespan of dogs. And so that's a deep tech company. It's a therapeutic, it's a gene therapy. But the output of that is really this consumer product, which is you inject your dog with this thing you don't even need to know what it is, and now your dog lives longer. And so from an output and a branding standpoint, it looks just like a consumer product company, but it's backed by this incredible science and defensibility. And so that's what really excites me, is that these things can look very similar to a consumer company. And again, the company building itself, you got to go through the same exercises of just building a great company, hiring great people, raising money. But then you get natural defensibility built in.
Yeah,
totally.
One of the things I think is really exciting, but also really challenging as an investor, is the types of signals that you look for when you're investing in deep tech companies. Some of those are the same, but some of those are different. You can't look at a seed Series A stage deep tech company usually and say, wow, revenue's ramping so quickly, user engagement looks great. Oftentimes these companies take years and years and years to develop and finally launch their product. So you have to start to look at different signals. And so a lot of the things we think about at Spark are what are those signals that you can look at, and how do you ideally not just have one kind of snapshot, but multiple snapshots in time to see the velocity of progress that deep tech companies are making. And I think a lot of it has to do with how fast companies are hiring the best technical minds and how quickly those technical minds are making technical progress. Mm-hmm. But figuring out the right things to look at can be quite difficult.
Definitely. I mean, it's all about slope of curve. And so if you can't look at the slope of curve of revenue or retention, you have to find other ways to look at the slope of curve and find momentum within these companies. And so a lot of that comes from John's point around hiring, around science, technical de-risk progress, some of these other metrics that you can't just comp to. And then the best part is that venture risk, not growth risk, which is what I focus on in this area. A lot of it just comes down to gut. Do you feel there's a lot of momentum here? Because it isn't in the numbers that you can just go to and look at.
Yeah. The other thing that I like too is the consumer part of deep tech, I think, feels much more intuitive. When you look at a company that's building a product, you can evaluate, would I want that product or not?
Yep.
Whereas the B2B side of deep tech, which we also invest in at Spark, is a little bit less intuitive. Oftentimes you're talking about industrial customers or customers that you might not understand as well. For consumer products, think about things that we've invested in like Oculus or Cruise or Wild Type. These are products that you could say, okay, pretend I don't know anything about the technology. Would I want this as a consumer? So in that way, it feels more like investing in consumer products or consumer internet companies.
How is investing in deep tech different in 2019, about to be 2020, versus 2015 or 2010? How have you seen it evolve over time?
Yeah, the frothiness, I would say, of the market actually really helps. And you can sometimes hear investors talk about a biotech or deep tech seed versus a consumer software seed, and really there is no rule of thumb, but how we think about it is it usually ends up skipping around, so it goes one round further. So what a traditional seed would be for software, maybe for a deep tech company ends up looking like a software Series A, and it's great because you need to hire more specialized talent. It usually takes longer to hit certain milestones in order to convince more, later stage investors to invest. And it's less pattern matching for investors, which just makes your life easier as a founder when it looks like other great companies. You're usually navigating in the dark and are one of the first to do it. And so I actually think largely the amount of capital that's flowing around in the venture ecosystem, and again, part of the traditional consumer companies being few and far between, is like a huge net positive for deep tech.
Yeah. I think the biggest difference over the last 4 or 5 years is the variety of different types of investors that are interested in funding these early stage, what initially kind of almost feel like projects. And like, I think if you look 4 or 5 years ago, there were a bunch of highly specialized funds that like did deep tech. And now fast forward 4 or 5 years, a lot of firms are sort of hiring a partner who's focusing more on deep tech, or little seed funds are starting that didn't exist before that are just focusing on something like synthetic biology. So I think there's sort of like, there's more breadth and more depth in terms of who's investing in the category, and there's just more shots on goal. Yeah. Which I don't think the success rate of these startups is necessarily increasing, but there's just more of them. And there's just going to be like a larger cohort that end up getting to Series A, Series B, Series C stage. Well, so I see this positive overall for the ecosystem.
Totally. And the other benefit too is that we're starting to see more enabling infrastructure for deep tech. Yeah. And so when that happens, and the perfect example would be like AWS getting people off of bare metal and having to run their own, is that if you're in the same way that like AWS dramatically lowered the bar to start a software company, you're seeing the same thing of multiple like lab as a service companies that is making it easier to be and to spin up a deep tech company. And so I think that's like this other mega trend that's like starting to happen and lower the bar and barrier to entry to start one of these companies.
Is there like what AWS did to software companies? This will happen to deep, sort of, it just becomes much easier to start deep tech companies?
I'm sure we've been pitched many companies, not to name names, that are building the AWS for fermentation, production, lab, lab automation, on and on.
Even here, like we're sitting here in a WeWork, there are equivalent, WeWork type businesses that are focused, for example, on biotech. And it sort of started out as a cottage industry like 5 or 6 years ago, and then they're kind of becoming more and more professionalized, institutionalized. You'll have shared lab equipment. If you raise $2 million, you can't afford to go spend $500K on some expensive equipment. But if 20 startups are all sharing the same equipment, somebody can amortize that into rent. Yeah. I think so. That trend, I think, is helping a lot too. Just easier access to shared equipment makes a big difference in terms of lowering the barrier to research and development.
Yeah, and even specialized accelerators and incubators, to come to mind. IndieBio has been phenomenal at funding these early stage companies in the space, and then also even like the Illumina accelerator, right? As you talk about equipment, giving the companies in their accelerator access to really, really expensive, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars of sequencing equipment that that infrastructure didn't exist 10 years ago to support these types of companies.
Yeah. And when people are talking about deep tech, is that sort of a synonym for frontier, or how do you sort of scope out what exactly is within scope of deep tech?
That's a good question. I don't know. I kind of think about it like, is core R&D central to the success of the company or not? Maybe that's a lightweight definition, but there's a lot of companies that are building technology and use technology, but there isn't sort of a core R&D problem that they're trying to solve that other people haven't really solved before.
Yeah, I think people like coming up with names whenever something is new, and then once it becomes a status quo, I think part having it enabled by this new wave of infrastructure, then it just becomes like technology companies, right? Like we don't really talk. We talk a little bit about like a software company versus a non-software company, but really all of that is grouped into like it's just technology investing. Yeah. And so to me, frontier, it just means it's new. Yeah. And hopefully over the next 5+ years, it starts to feel less new and more just like, this is technology investing.
Yeah. And so one of the things haven't made investments in. One of the things you've made investments in, John, is agtech and food.
Yep.
And so why don't you dig deeper into out of all the spaces, why you noticed some big opportunities there and why you made the bets you did. And It's funny, after this podcast, Justin Maris from, Justin Maris, he had this rant about Beyond Meats. He's not a fan of Beyond Meats. His D2C food bone broth company in Texas that's doing quite well. And you're, of course, an investor in one of those food companies. What do you...
Yeah, and this is an area that Greg actually knows super well too, so I'm curious to hear his thoughts. I think the thing that's happening right now in deep tech and ag specifically, like there's this whole software thing happening in ag, which is exciting, slow but steady, where these farms are modernizing. The way that people are thinking about supply chain is modernizing. That's driving a lot of venture investment. But then there's the other side of it, which is like new technology hitting the farm for the first time, robotics, other types of interesting hardware like hydroponics. And then, in the meat world where Greg and I both have, are involved with companies, there's a bunch of stuff happening around meat, whether it's plant-based meat or cultured meat. Suddenly there's this cultural thing happening around, concern around the environment and concern around, animal cruelty and how are we going to feed the planet. And then also, biotech suddenly is like, wow, we can actually start to do some of these things in relatively short periods of time at relatively reasonable costs. So I think there's a bunch of different things that are all happening at once that are kind of converging. But it's a sort of mix of, I don't know, it's like Anthony Bourdain food culture on one side, environmental concerns on the other side, robotics coming in, biotech coming in, and it's creating this, and software, of course, and it's creating this sort of special moment right now for food and ag tech.
Yeah. And I mean, at the end of the day, market size rules everything. And
huge.
People eat 3 times a day. The global meat market is a true $1 trillion market. I know that's in vogue to say a lot of different markets are $1 trillion markets. It truly is. And
that's big.
And so I think the fact that the size of opportunity here, again, if the science works, and then there's so much environmental impact as well. Around carbon reduction. I forget the actual statistic. I wish I knew. I should know it off the top of my head of the amount of carbon dioxide that's given into the environment, released into the environment from cows and animals. It's dramatic.
It's on the order of 10% or something of all of our emissions.
Yeah, and so there are sort of all of these effects starting at the tip of the spear around can we make meat more affordable and more accessible, and then it goes down from there.
Yeah. And so what would you sort of say are your requests for startups within deep tech? What opportunities are you really looking at, or you want entrepreneurs to experiment with, or that you want to potentially fund in the future?
Yeah, I want and this is sort of generalized, and maybe I'll think of a specific answer as John's talking. I think in terms of what is the consumer product output, right? And so, again, what we discussed earlier in the podcast is longevity, increasing the age of a pet as pet owners become pet parents. That consumer product really cuts through the noise and doesn't exist. No one to date is doing that. And so, to me, the question is, what are the consumer products that can be enabled by some sort of advancement in technology? And so, we've talked about food being a big one, longevity is another one, but I would say probably something around carbon reduction, emissions, something that can help the global warming disaster that we have going on feels like one of the most impactful, important areas that I'd love to see someone working on.
I am starting to see more entrepreneurs interested in tackling things.
100%.
Are you guys seeing anything you're interested there?
In and around climate?
Yeah.
We, I'd say the closest we've gotten at Spark is just stuff that in and around food and ag, which obviously, as we discussed before, has this kind of strong tie-in. YC is doing a lot of really interesting work around carbon and around kind of this. I don't know if they want to brand it or if the community wants to brand it as clean tech, but it is sort of like clean tech 2.0.
Right.
But it's not, hey, let's try to compete with mass manufacturing solar panels in China with different technology here in the US. It's let's take kind of very different, very distinct angles. And so I think it's exciting. It feels like there's something bubbling up. Like
Totally.
2 years ago, no one was talking about this. People are calling it like the Greta effect.
Yeah.
I've heard a couple of people use that term. There's just sort of an awareness about it now. And I get emails all the time from people, particularly in food and ag, who are like, I work in an investment bank or I work at a consulting firm. I really want to get into ag tech because I just believe in the mission. I believe in the need to do something there. How can I get involved? And that, I think, is happening a lot in climate right now. It's exciting.
And I'm a little more cynical on... I think it's hard to go and create a company that just says, hey, we're going to attack climate change. Because as much as like I care, I think the rest of the world doesn't. And so the way that I've approached it is ideally it is a derivative effect or downstream effect of a company that is solving a more tangible problem right now, right? Like, you know, one of our investments that we made at Box Group was Bowery Farming. And so building a vertical urban farm right outside of metropolitan cities will allow you to have higher quality, ideally cheaper. They're starting with Bib lettuce and produce. But the effect of that, obviously, is that hopefully we can lower greenhouse emissions. Same with Memphis Meats, growing synthetic animal protein. The like downstream effect is ideally impacting the climate, but I think it's hard to just go after that right now, at least until there's some regulatory change.
I think that's the biggest. If I think about this wave of interest in like food, ag, energy versus the one 10 years ago or so, I feel like this one has a lot more focus on products and a lot more focus on consumer. The one area that I think is really interesting, which is tied in with all this, is plants. Like my wife is probably, like, if she listens to this, which I hope she does, probably roll her eyes, but I've gotten really into indoor and outdoor plants, and I just feel like the urban, you know, millennial who like probably doesn't have kids yet and maybe doesn't have enough space for a dog or a cat, like plants are this like amazing living thing that they could interact with and take care of. And I've seen a couple of interesting companies.
Did you see Bloomscape in Detroit?
I did not see that one.
Yeah. Well, anyways, I'll share it offline.
I'll talk about it, but I think there's something to do there, and like synthetic biology, plants. Totally. How do you take like there's something interesting. I think that's going to cook up around that space, which is kind of still the same as it's been for the last like 100 years.
Totally. Are there any other requests for startups you might have, John? Whether it's or where you want to see entrepreneurs experiment and build, whether it's in ag tech, food, or just deep tech more broadly?
I think fertility is a really interesting area that's getting a lot of investment, you know, and attention right now. I have like lots and lots of friends who've, you know, gotten their eggs frozen just proactively. I also have a lot of friends, of course, who've done IVF. I feel like that whole process is still incredibly expensive and draining and difficult. And there's going to be innovation, not just on the like financing and brand, but also sort of on the core technology side to make that cheaper, better, faster. This is also like a bit edgy, but I do think that there's going to be a lot more that's done sort of around like genetics and genetic modification. Probably not initially with humans, but maybe pets is an interesting place to start. And I think that like 100 years from now, stuff like that's probably going to be mainstream. And the way we get there, we have to be very careful and very thoughtful. But there's going to be some very like interesting, ambitious, edgy companies that kind of get built in and around that space. So I'm curious to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I'll give one more tangible one that's in and around the pet space, and it's actually how I found this gene therapy to increase the lifespan of dogs. Is that I was actually looking for there's a company in Korea that does dog cloning. And I actually wanted to find one here in the United States.
Wow.
So I haven't found it yet. So that's like a very tangible. I would love to find a company that is cloning dogs for exactly the same reason that John mentioned, which is I think in deep tech you have to look for regulatory arb. And so if you're building a longevity company for humans, it's 10 years plus and tens of millions of dollars to even get to the does this maybe even work clinical trial area. And then obviously with dogs and pets, it's much, much faster. It looks like 2.5 to 3 years, and maybe $3 to $5 million. And so I think looking for regulatory arb and again having a really clear consumer product is super valuable.
We're actually investing with you in that.
I know.
Really?
Yeah, I know.
So exciting. That's left out.
Yeah. Well, It's okay.
I know. I generalized it, but
Totally. We're excited. Let's talk about new computing platforms, VR, AR, quantum. John, how have you thought about it? Where are you crypto, of course? How have you thought about where are you excited?
Yeah, so I'd say we've been interested in kind of all of the above at Spark. And, we were investors in Oculus, and we're investors in an awesome, actually a bunch of companies that are focusing on kind of AR from North, which used to be called Thaumic Labs, to a company Niantic behind Pokemon Go. I think that we're just the cusp of like the really interesting mass adoptable consumer applications in VR and AR. It's not really my area of specialty or focus, but I'm super excited for kind of the world discovering what those are over time. I think that there's a couple of social applications in VR that are really interesting. People may have heard of like Rec Room, for example, which have a sort of like organic social network type feel, and I think there's going to be a lot more stuff like that unfolds. Quantum computing is something that I'm fascinated with. I actually took like a couple of days last week and just went super deep into the science. So I was a physics major undergrad, and so I was like dusted off some of my quantum textbooks, and I bought a quantum computing textbook specifically. It's so cool. Yeah. It's one of those things that I still can't figure out, and I've met with a ton of companies. We've looked at a lot. I still can't figure out, is this best done at Google or IBM or in a startup? And there's probably pros and cons. And then B, is this something that really starts hitting like commercially in like 2 to 3 years, or is it more like 5 to 10 or 15 years? But it's amazing the kind of things you're gonna be able to do when quantum computers really work well.
And for the uninitiated, maybe give like a 1 minute to TLDR.
Sure. Okay, I'm gonna screw this up so badly.
It's okay.
Essentially, basically what you're working with in a quantum computer is quantum memory versus memory that we typically think about in the form of bits or ones and zeros. And in quantum memory, the things you can do that are interesting are due to this concept of superposition. So in a bit, you have either a 1 or a 0. In a quantum bit or a qubit, you have some combination of a 1 and a 0 that's existing simultaneously. And when you measure it, it has to decide, is it a 1 or is it a 0? The cool thing is when you do math and you basically perform logical functions or run these things through gates, as it were, you can actually perform this math on all of the different combinations of bits that exist. So instead of saying, hey, we have a 0, that 0 is going to go into a certain logical function, we could say, hey, we have a 0 or a 1, let's put both of those through at the same time. So you start to get speed up in ways that's very unintuitive, and you can start to do things like factor very large multiples of prime numbers, search through databases, etc., at rates that are polynomially or exponentially faster than the way that a traditional computer would work. Right now, it's very difficult to do any of those things because the quantum computers that we have are extraordinarily basic and difficult to operate. But in a world where they worked really well, it starts to revolutionize the way that we think about huge chunks of the computing industry.
Cool. Yeah. Greg, how about you in terms of new computing platform?
Yeah, so the way that I approach it is actually and I don't know if Chris Dixon was the one that actually sort of coined this term, but if you actually look at the primitives that any of these things unlock, you actually don't need developer primitives. You don't necessarily need a new computing platform, right? So every time a new version of iOS comes out, I go and read through the SDK and say okay, are you unlocking the ability for me to now share my screen easily, right? Mm-hmm. That is a new developer primitive. It doesn't have to be a new platform. And so at the end of the day, the reason why new platforms are so interesting, VR, AR, is that they're less mature and they're constantly adding more and more of these underlying primitives to an SDK, and ultimately that gives fuel to developers to go build really interesting things. And so, of course, I'm interested in always looking through what Oculus and other great VR companies are doing, what Apple will hopefully announce with their AR headset. But I also think that if you actually boil down whether it's a new or mature platform to the underlying primitives that you're giving developers, that's the unit that I really care about.
No. Like sort of Lego blocks.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah. What are the Lego blocks that you're giving a developer to actually go build really compelling new experiences? It just so happens that the mobile platforms are pretty mature, but again, I'm super bullish on what's happening with screen sharing, how we're going to start moving. If you think about what Twitch has done, like the evolution there from, in order to watch someone play video games, you had to physically be in person.
Yeah.
And then Twitch, came out of Justin TV, and now they have native products like in Xbox and PlayStation. And now with iOS, I think we're going to move to a concept of like everyone is a streamer now.
Yeah.
And I think that's enabled. It doesn't exist yet, but it's enabled by Apple and Android, Apple and Google, allowing that primitive of, okay, you can access the video buffer coming out of the screen.
Right.
And I'm excited to see more consumer or social applications like really play off of that.
Yeah. Are there other examples of companies that you could see emerging from that trend, or just broadly, we mentioned sort of consumer slowdown, but any other consumer social companies that you want to see exist or think could...
Yeah, I think Squad's a really cool consumer social app that is really playing on this idea of screen sharing.
You want to describe it for the uninitiated?
It works very similarly to how you'd imagine like a Skype conversation, only on mobile. But it is super seamless and easy to start sharing your screen. So the best way is like go try out the app. But I think there's a couple of interesting effects when you sort of come to like screen sharing first. One of and I think they're fine with me saying this, but one of the really early compelling use cases that they're seeing is people actually, significant others, couples, friends, sharing their camera roll with their significant other. And why that's so interesting is it actually changes the paradigm between push versus pull content. So like right now, if I am on a trip and I want to share a bunch of photos that I've taken with my girlfriend or significant other, I have to go and individually select the photos that I want to push to them. And that takes a lot of time. And it's not a shared experience, right? It's async. And so what screen sharing allows me to do is I get to go enter into a synchronous conversation, and then just have this shared experience going through like, oh, here are all the photos, and she'll say like, hey, go into that one looks really cool, and it really changes the dynamic. Even though the unit is still the same, which is like, I want to go see the pictures that you took. And so I think that's like a really fascinating way to make something feel like a pull and not a push.
Yeah. Are there any other primitives that you're just waiting to come out or you think could be super interesting if they emerged? If nothing comes to mind, no pressure.
I think an obvious example is CRISPR. Being able, as John said, to edit, the underlying code of living and breathing things. Like I remember when I was a kid, I used to like go around and say like nanobots are coming. They're going to be like these little computers all in our blood running around and give us superpowers. Turns out like it's not nano computers. It's actually just reprogramming the like true DNA in our system. That's the nanobots. And so I think more tools in infrastructure to make it really easy, as easy it is to flip a couple bits or qubits, to actually edit and change the DNA of humans or do dog cloning, I think is going to be really impactful.
Yeah. And where in crypto are you excited right now, Greg? And I'm curious how that's evolved over time because you've been looking at it for a few years now.
Yeah. To me, one of the cool primitives in crypto is actually regulatory arb. Is that no one knows how to define this thing. And so what that means is that you get coverage to actually go and just like experiment and build things. And hopefully they get to enough scale before people get into trouble. And if you look at some of the biggest businesses, whether it's Uber or Airbnb, all of those were built on some sense of like regulatory arbitrage and then just got to a point where their scale was so large. And so some examples of that in crypto is, how do you, it's all focused on money. And so how can you, move money or value across borders? How can you safely store money? And I'm using money generally. Doesn't matter what the token or instrument is. I think those are interesting primitives. You're seeing a lot in DeFi coming up. But again, at least the view that I see it, is around the cross-border regulatory arb. I think it's probably going to be one of the first killer use cases.
It kind of already is.
It is obviously, Bitcoin's. But I think there are other instrumentation there, and I think it's also hard. I admit, like, as someone who lives in the United States, like, a lot of the DeFi value props don't resonate and matter to me because we have a really mature, incredible financial institution and system. And so I think I'm just trying to spend more time and learn what the pain points are. There's this company that was focused on cross-border, sending money back home so that their family could buy staples. And instead of taking whatever the hit was on however they were doing money transfer, and someone was taking 30%, you can leverage crypto as the mechanism to actually do that transaction. But from the end consumer standpoint, all they know is that they use this consumer front end and product to send their money back home, and then there's a POS that sits in the supermarket in X country that allows them to go buy staples. And so increasingly, like, invisible crypto, I think is going to be really powerful because no one cares about the regulatory arb. They just care about what can you actually do with this thing.
I like the term invisible crypto, and I think that's where we get really excited also at Spark, is when there's just beautiful products that are made that consumers or business people love that happen to have crypto on the back end.
Yeah, they should know that it's powered by crypto. Right. It should just feel like magic.
And ideally, it's something that could only be built with crypto, because if it could be built otherwise, it would definitely be built otherwise. Because crypto is not the most convenient way of building something. Usually.
You guys did Rare Bits.
We did Rare Bits. We also did Coinbase and a couple of other investments, and so we're really focused on finding these, like, very product-oriented founders that are saying we're going to build, like, a beautiful, amazing experience that happens to leverage crypto. Interestingly, though, this first wave of innovation around crypto over the last, I don't know if it's fair to call it first wave, but major wave over the last 4 or 5 years, it's been almost exclusively focused on the infrastructure and developer tools and kind of laying the groundwork for what eventually become those products.
Yeah.
So for that reason, like, you look through we've made probably 3 or 4 or 5 maybe investments that touch crypto in one way or another out of, I don't know, 120 or 150. Yeah. I think we'll do many more in the future as it starts to become more and more application focused, and less kind of basic infrastructure focused.
Yeah. And the great thing about crypto is that, again, the ethos of the space is really grounded in open source. And so I think what this allows is that my gut says that the biggest companies over the next 2 to 3 years, crypto-focused companies, whether they define themselves as crypto or not, or just are leveraging it, will end up going full stack. And part of the value of having the crypto ecosystem sort of be built on open source is that you get to, even if you own the full stack and end up building additional components and pieces to the underlying infrastructure, you can get up to speed so much faster because of the work that everyone else has done.
Yeah.
And I don't subscribe to the religious ideology of, like, you have to use this enabling infrastructure. You can't modify it. I think at the end of the day, it's just like, can you leverage all the work that people have done on the infrastructure side, whether you actually fork and change the underlying infrastructure to suit what you're doing, or you can just use it out of the box. But I do think you're going to have to, at least in the next couple of years, own the full stack to show people what is possible here. Because there aren't a bunch of examples of, like, full stack crypto companies or crypto enabled companies that aren't, pure play sort of enabling infrastructure like I would say Coinbase is. And Coinbase is getting there with some of their wallets and sort of other pieces. But that core business is still a custody provider.
Yeah. One trend, or one thing you've mentioned a couple times is regulatory arb. And I'm curious if there are other spaces where you think there's sort of a unique advantage to regulatory arb. One sort of, emerging over like 100-year time frame that is, and I've been spending a lot of time with Balaji from Coinbase recently, is startup cities, charter cities, which is directly trying to address regulatory arb. I'm curious if there are other spaces that you think benefit from regulatory arb or trying to address that in sort of interesting ways.
I don't know if this is technically regulatory arb, and I'd probably get in trouble if I said it was, but healthcare, specifically telehealth, I don't want to say that it's the reason I say it's not really regulatory arb is that actually individual states have sort of been making progress on saying how can you build a patient physician relationship. But I think the challenge there is that it's so unique and the interpretation is on a state-by-state basis. So even if you get clarity in one state, I'm an investor in this company Row, which is the hold company for Roman and Rory and a couple of other brands. And they're operating across 50 states. And so each state has their own definition, and again, you have to do your own interpretation of how you can build that patient-physician relationship via telehealth, whether it has to be synchronous, asynchronous, does it need a video chat, how do you ask the specific amount of questions in order to give a physician in that state enough data in order to successfully diagnose them. That changes per condition. And so maybe it's not regulatory arb, but it's regulatory complexity.
Totally.
That I think is really exciting in healthcare. The whole consumerization of healthcare is another mega trend that I'm incredibly bullish on.
Yeah, and the other place that I would point to is what's happening around labor too.
Yeah.
It's obviously it's a touchy and difficult subject. Within the United States, obviously there's these big kind of questions around W-2 or 1099. But then even thinking about more broadly, we have huge issues around not being able to bring folks into our country that we want to work in these companies. And I think that's led alongside, great productivity tools, et cetera, to this explosion in remote work and thinking about how do we efficiently set up offices in other countries? How do we efficiently operate completely distributed teams? How do you deal with the regulatory complexity of having employees in all of these different countries? And I think that being able to do that well has become a big source of competitive advantage for a lot of companies, and then also being able to provide that has also become a really big business.
Totally.
And that's sort of an interesting thing. I mean, obviously that's been around for a long time, but that seems like, pretty much every conversation I have with a startup today, there's some question around what's your strategy for just building distributed team, going to other countries, remote teams, et cetera. And it wasn't, 5 years ago.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about, John, about labor marketplaces.
Yeah.
And if you've found, Bedrock is obviously a huge investor in RigUp. Mm-hmm. If you found things that you're excited about or how you think about the future of labor marketplaces or the unbundling of LinkedIn.
Yeah, it's an area that I think is evergreen. I just think that essentially, if you look at the way that the labor markets are structured, many parts of the economy, in fact, probably most parts of the economy have some flexing up and flexing down of demand for labor, whether it's on an hourly basis or a weekly basis or monthly or et cetera. And you'll have people who support that. And oftentimes just temp agencies set up or different types of staffing agencies that have been around and haven't changed for decades that support these industries. RigUp is an awesome company. I wish Spark were an investor in RigUp that is, addressing this for the oil and gas industry. But if you look, hospitality, retail, healthcare is a huge one. I'm invested in one in the life sciences space. There's so many industries that utilize labor in ways that are not obvious. And I think that we live in a world now where everybody's looking at, what are the ways where I can get the most out of my career, earn a great income, have flexibility. And if you can find ways of stitching together labor and opportunity in a clever way, I think you can start to really make a dent in some of these very old school staffing industries that have existed for a long time. So we're investing in a lot of companies in this space. We're invested in, for example, in Instawork, which is in the hospitality space. I already mentioned Clora, which is his life sciences one. Just did another one, which we haven't yet announced, but talk about soon in another industry. Of course, in B2C, you look at things like Uber, Lyft, Postmates, DoorDash. There's been sort of like a lot of attention given there over the last 10 years. But I think increasingly B2B labor marketplaces are becoming interesting. And then things like Andela, which is sort of in this remote work engineering staffing space. And there's a bunch of other companies like Terminal and others that are going after that in different ways. So I see it as this huge evergreen space. It's going to take advantage of new software. It's going to take advantage of new culture also. The cultural shifts that are going on in the way that we work really impact the ability for these companies to kind of get traction quickly into scale.
Right. And the only other thing that I would say around the labor marketplaces, which is interesting, is that everyone calls himself a labor marketplace, but you actually have to discern whether it is a true marketplace or actually just a job board. And at least the way that I think about it is that you have to bind the transaction between the supply and demand. And what I mean by that is if you're a hospital system, if you're not in as like a software layer in that demand, meaning you're like seeing the demand as it comes from the hospital system and doing the matching to supply that's on your platform, which are, let's call it a nurse, a physician. If you don't have visibility into that entire transaction, then you're not a true marketplace in my mind. Which is fine. You can build big businesses just being a job board, but you really need to own that full stack in order to be a true labor marketplace in my mind.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of first cuts at these labor areas,
yes,
and looking more like a job board.
Yeah.
And building something that's full stack, I think, is significantly more capital intensive and more difficult. Yeah. But I think ultimately the reward is larger as well.
Yeah, and you got to start somewhere, right? Like most people start on the supply side, capture a bunch of great supply, and you can end up routing that, even if it has to be really manual or managed at the beginning. But ultimately, you want to get the true sense of what is GMV, what is placement.
Yeah.
In order to do that, you need to not only just own the supply, you need to own the demand as well.
Yeah. And this is obviously an outlier in the job board space, but I read some tweet that Indeed did like $4 billion.
Yeah,
Indeed's
year.
an incredible business. Amazing
Yeah.
business.
Yeah.
Shout out to USV. That's a monster.
And I'd be curious about you think about Craigslist. Like there's a couple of businesses that have just been unbelievable around this. It does make me think though that there's going to be places to pick off.
Yeah,
and that it's not. Like on its own, in aggregate, Indeed is great, and I have a lot of respect for the company. But there's probably vulnerabilities on an industry by industry basis where you say, I could build a 10x better experience if I owned the whole experience and it weren't just sort of a job board. And so a lot of these new B2B labor marketplaces are basically looking at what are Indeed's top categories, where are the biggest issues, and where could technology really help. I think one place that we think about is where is there urgency. Yeah. Because if there's urgency, a job board is probably not your friend. If there's urgency, you need a service that's going to find you someone very, very quickly.
Yeah.
If you can wait for 3 months, then a job board is probably fine. If you need someone in 2 hours, you can't rely on a job board. So I think the more high urgency cases are the places where sort of a full stack marketplace is. If you think about Uber, it's the same thing, right? If you could call a taxi and wait for the next day, it's a lot less important than like I need someone right now.
Totally. I'm going to be sensitive to time. Maybe last question: is there a space that we haven't yet discussed that you are curious to go deeper on, or have gone deep on, but you haven't yet found a company in the space, or decided for whatever reason, hey, you're just not going to make a bet there? It's too early, or it's too late. It's can't get there yet, or want to get there but haven't yet. And if not, we can end on the last question.
I say never. But for me, it's fertility. We have not yet made a bet in fertility. It feels like it's just such an interesting category.
Yeah.
So there's going to be many multi-billion-dollar businesses, I think, built around fertility.
Yeah.
I think about it, where is there uncomfortable risk? And I remember 3 to 4 years ago looking at Memphis Meats and Geltor as investments in synthetic biology. That felt really like uncomfortable risk. Like, what do I, I was an engineer by trade before I got into venture, and I was like, what do I know about synbio? And again, back to like the laws of physics of company building are the same. I think you can meet all the teams that are working on it, and ideally at true venture risk, you can hopefully pick the right ones. And so, right now, I think uncomfortable risk is sort of in 2 areas. One, we talked about, I think, therapeutics. Super, super uncomfortable. Yes. Most VCs will say, sorry, like we're good with synbio, but we're not good with therapeutics. Goodbye. So I think that's one, and is part of the reason doing the gene therapy dog company that we talked about. And then 2, it's funny because this has been the best category of the last decade is pure consumer social. I think most people do not want to take true venture risk, early stage risk there. They're like, oh, let's wait until we see like metrics and engagement. And by then, especially with all the capital flowing around, it is, a consumer social company that's actually working is going to be the most competitive deal in the world. And so I think taking early consumer social, pre-seed and seed risk feels very, very uncomfortable. So those are the 2 areas that I want to lean into.
My guests today have been John Melas-Kyriazi of Spark and Greg Rosen of Bedrock. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.